record, people will gather it through context clues.
Yeah, okay, sounds good. Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Kate. I don't know if she's on, but we met in I met Kate in Oregon. I'm sorry, Washington, actually, Tacoma for an EMEF gathering. And Patrick, I've heard your name several times, and maybe we connected in 2017, maybe we didn't, but it was great to connect in Roanoke and see you come all the way out from the Pacific Northwest. And yeah, as Patrick said, I'm a professor forest management at Virginia Tech, and have been working in the agroforestry arena space since 2008. I teach the agroforestry course at Virginia Tech, and I have a three-way appointment. I have an extension appointment, research, and teaching. So I'm kind of spread across all of the different initiatives that land-grant universities are involved in. And so I do have a research program in agroforestry. I also train foresters at the federal level on silviculture. So I, focus on some canopy issues. But the great thing about the agroforestry space is that it's taken me out of the forest, and I'm able to work with farmers. But the flip side of the agroforestry equation is that we also think about cultivation or farming underneath the canopy. And we have lots of woodlands here, eastern side of the state or the country. And Appalachia in particular is rich in understory biodiversity and has a long tradition. And I'll touch on some of that as we move along. But yeah, Patrick invited me to come speak to the working group about my experience, some of the history around developing coalitions here, because one person or one entity can't do it alone when it comes to landscape level change. Partnerships are critical, and we have a vast expanse of forest lands here with, like I mentioned earlier, this kind of rich history of understory product use and harvesting and that type of thing. We have a lot of biodiversity, and are tied into longstanding markets associated with some of the understory. So as a forest management professor, extension specialist, I think about, from the forest floor all the way up to the canopy. We need to manage our trees, but we also need to manage our shrubs and our shade obligate plant species and fungi and all those other things that are goods from the woods, so to speak, that come out and have for quite some time. And how do we continue to kind of evolve in terms of our interrelationship with those understory species. And agroforestry as a model of intentional cultivation is coming online as an avenue to add value, but also build in sustainability. Okay. So thanks for having me. I'm on the east side, so yes, your 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock time frame is my 6 o'clock time frame. But we do on the eastern side of the United States have a lot of deciduous forests, mixed mesophytic forests primarily. We do have 30 some million acres of pine plantations or stands that have been established in the southeast. And as you go farther north, you kind of move into the kind of boreal transition area where you get more of you get a reduction in species composition, and it moves more towards conifers. But here in the pocket, in central Appalachia, you can look at the landscape and see we just have this, highly diverse mixed mesophytic forest, primarily hardwoods with some conifers that are mixed in. We have a deep tradition in the area because of the extensive biodiversity of understory plant and fungi harvesting and use. And that goes back to the indigenous communities that, lived and worked on this land before, we had any colonial activity that occurred. And that tradition merged with some of that colonial knowledge and led into a continuation and kind of an expansion use of understory species and those that are not associated with timber. We call them non-timber forest products, NTFPs. You may have heard of that. And that tradition, in terms of kind of natural products and use for medicine and food, and before we had refrigeration and mass transportation, was critical for communities in the region. And then there was a bit of a revolution in the 19th century around use of natural medicine products, and it kind of led to the formulation or shaping of kind of a codified medicine program that depended a lot upon species that come from our woodlands. Now there's open land species as well that are part of the medicinal trade. But the market evolved over time, and the expansion of population and demand on those materials continued to grow. And there's a tradition in the region, and there is in the Pacific Northwest as well, of course, but here that market continued to grow, and the basis for supply essentially was tied to wild harvesting. There's been cultivation, of course, over time, but as the market grew, it was really about the fact that there was mass expanses of some of these understory species that were in demand, and they were growing naturally. And so the wild harvest community or wild harvest sourcing was the basis for supply in the region. And that a little bit of history there, but that takes us to kind of a contemporary sense where we've seen just in the last 20 years extensive growth in demand for species that are endemic here or Pacific Northwest in our forest lands. And Appalachia, actually, when it comes to the global nutraceutical market, 50% of the species that are sourced into that trade are native to this region. So it really is a hot spot. And my experience has been over the years of talking about forest farming or NTFPs, and people often go right to ginseng because it has an interesting supply chain associated primarily with large demand out of East Asia. It's very lucrative. There's been television shows that have come up around, hunting ginseng and those types of things. But this is not a ginseng talk because of the diversity that historically has been involved in trade in the region. And it is a presentation about ginseng and other non-timber forest products and the role of stakeholders in these forest farming coalitions that are looking toward change in terms of trying, as this market expands, working to ensure that we are protecting the sustainability of plant populations and that there's product quality, there's predictability around what comes out of our woodlands, and that can add value to some of these forest-dependent communities that have this tradition that I was discussing earlier. And we conducted some market-based research in the region out of Virginia Tech in the 2015, 2016 timeframe. And we were working to understand the scope of trade. And you can see above and beyond ginseng, the numerous species that are traded out of the region. These were all reported by primary buyers that buy from wild harvesters that are bringing material out of the forest. And some of the classics are golden seal, bloodroot, black cohosh, and some of those are harvested at 2 and 3 times the rate of ginseng. So ginseng has kind of an iconic status, but at the end of the day, there are scores of more species that are coming out of woodlands in our region. And so that just gives you an idea of the scope. And the role of this stakeholder forest farming coalitions is to work to advance and evolve market in the region so that the value associated with those species and the people and communities that are harvesting is recognized, but doing that through intentionality and sustainability and predictability regarding supply, because the wild harvesting side of the equation, sometimes there's a mystery around what's coming out, what were the impacts to the resource. Product quality sometimes is a question mark as well. So this is trying to work in some formality and predictability to promote forest farming and bring some of that value or retain some of that value as the market grows with respect to these species. So that brings me to the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition. Well, what is it? It's a network of stakeholders that share a common goal of improving this agroforestry model of production, this intentionality, and helping to build farming capabilities so that, we have a base of production that can fit within some of the issues that I noted earlier in terms of predictability, sustainability, traceability, and value addition. And our goal is to increase rates of forest farming through education, training, research, planting stock supply, development, workforce development, agritourism, business planning. So again, trying to work in some formality. And it's not just, I want to be clear about this, it's not just, forest farming is not based upon owning land and planting. It's also, within the broader umbrella, it involves just essentially the practice of stewardship and sustainability associated with tending those stands to produce that raw material that's in demand. So you can own land, and we've worked with many landowners that have planted and are growing to market, but it also involves those wild harvesters that want to be part of value addition in terms of their work in the woodlands and kind of carrying on that cultural tradition, but doing it in a way that throughout the supply chain is recognized in terms of the intentionality and that kind of stewardship activity. Our partnership is broad and diverse. We have university partners, we have agency partners, and we also have a bevy of nonprofit service organizations that are working on the same issues throughout the region. In 2020, we were the recipient of the APA Herbal Insight Award. APA is the American Herbal Products Association, for our work to develop this coalition and provide those services. And to give you a bit of a timeline, the coalition didn't happen overnight. It took some time to build because of our broad, diverse partnership and the fact that historically, a lot of organizations and agencies and universities were kind of working on these issues, but maybe siloed or on their own tracks. We wanted to kind of come together around that work on an individual organizational basis and develop a community of practice. And so we proposed to do that to USDA, and they awarded some funding to bring together all of these organizations, become familiar with the different activities that individuals were involved in, build trust, and develop some strategic roadmaps for how we could work together across this broad physiographic region of Appalachia, and leverage that for greater impact. And so from 2011 to 2014, that's exactly what happened. We had a community of practice that formed. Virginia Tech was leading this. And that led to a roadmap that was then proposed to USDA again through a different outfit in NIFA, the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. And they saw fit to fund that, and we created a coalition. And we identified kind of operational activities in a broad distributed sense. And yeah, universities leading it as the principal, but really it was more of a distributed model where the resources that were coming to Virginia Tech were pushed out to these different organizations, but we were all working together. So there was some coherency in that effort through the coalition. And we had a great first round from 2015 to 2018, far surpassed our objectives in terms of numbers of programs and individuals engaged and farms established, and made a bit of a presence. And we were able to connect with some other stakeholders that were not part of our initial kind of visioning. And then we received a second round of funding in 2019. And so the coalition continued, and that's continued until this year. And I can cover a little bit more about how we've transitioned, but Other things have happened, and I'm going to move beyond this slide. We have more than 2,000 members to kind of get into some of the details. But I've already touched on this a little bit, but the current situation is that there is this changing NTFP market that's focusing on this traceability, predictability, high quality, and sustainable supply of non-timber forest products to these industries that depend upon that raw material, but also working to advance revenue potential. Again, thinking about that component of keeping some of the value here in those resources as opposed to all of that financial value kind of moving down the supply chain. So trying to strike that balance. And what we've seen, like I mentioned earlier with Patrick when we were first discussing, is that never before has seen federal and private investments in agroforestry in general, but specifically in this context, in terms of forest farming with producer support, technical service provider training, nursery production, a lot of that's coming online. And I think people are starting to see the value in forest farming, providing that opportunity to improve the supply chain, both in terms of its efficiencies, but the value addition and what that means to communities in these forest dependent, which are also often economically distressed communities. And so here you can see a note from APA, the American Herbal Products Association, celebrating the coalition, noting in its trade newsletter that we've trained hundreds, and so that we're getting some industry recognition again in terms of that supply chain angle, but also thinking about how we label, how we promote, how we brand products that are associated with these intentional production practices, and locally, regionally, providing the infrastructure that's necessary for those forest farm products to be suitable to move to market. And then working with companies that see fit to label products that are purchased here for value-added materials or products that are put on the shelves for consumers. And how do we do this? Well, you can see kind of a suite of different images here and promotional materials associated with the different types of training activities that we have, the outreach, engagement across these different organizations that are part of the coalition. Again, all kind of operating on the same track. And these have happened over the years and across the region. We've also developed a beautiful website with kind of a clearinghouse for information where you can go and learn about a lot of the different initiatives. You can access published information like our extension newsletters. We have an enormous bevy of video resources where local experts who have been forest farming for years have offered graciously their expertise to help distribute that information. We also work in the peer-reviewed publication space, and we have a newsletter that comes out periodically. You can see the latest there from autumn 2023. And we've developed technology to help with siting. We have a plant shoe application. The NRCS now has made part of their program through NRCS related to their forest farming standard. And this heat map application essentially allows for any individual, it's public access, to query up to 1,000 acres of woodlands around several species of interest to generate these heat maps to identify areas where the habitat, which we know related to where we see these species growing in the wild, doesn't look quite as good as it does in maybe other areas. And you can see an example there where you see green versus red. Some of those red areas don't kind of stack up in terms of having the suitable habitat, but those green areas do. So this helps someone who wants to plant, wants to farm, who has 200 acres, kind of identify areas to rule out and then focus in on areas where we see better habitat. We've also been able to generate legislator interest. Our two senators, federal senators here in Virginia, have been strong advocates, Mark Warner and Senator Tim Kaine. Written letters to the Forest Service extolling what we're up to, what we're working on, have been strong advocates for our proposals. You can also see our former governor coming out to the Catawba Sustainability Center that Virginia Tech owns, where we have a lot of forest farming activities occurring, learning about what we're up to. But above and beyond that, we're also working on the kind of public outreach side. One of our partners, U Mountain Center, has developed a mountain medicine trail to help celebrate the production, forest farming, and the use of some of the understory species. The Monuments Across Appalachia, Virginia is a family foundation funded project that one of those that was selected to develop a monument is around non-timber forest products in this region. And it is a really nice complement to the work that we're doing to draw attention to the importance of the green resource in the region. And then most recently, we had this conference that was mentioned earlier in Roanoke, where we had people from across the country and even internationally come to join around the growth of forest farming, respecting the past, honoring that past, but also shaping the future. We've conducted research too. I mentioned we are in that space, but trying to understand, where's the product moving? You can see that we've done some mapping of NTFP trade. So this can complement our understanding of how to help individuals and forest farmers or aspiring forest farmers understand what are the kind of demands in their region. And you can see we have black cohosh mapped, and those darker spots are where we see higher volumes of trade. So those are hot spots. So if you're a forest farmer in southern West Virginia or Southwest Virginia, you're thinking about what would I like to grow that has a robust market. Well, black cohosh is one. You can see golden seal, kind of the same outcome, southern West Virginia, Southwest Virginia, but you can also see in southern Indiana, there's trade that's happening there at certain rates around golden seal. And false unicorn, which may have a bit of a different kind of habitat pattern, we see more active trade around false unicorn in Western North Carolina. So we're doing that research, but we're also asking who will farm. And we've published some studies associated with who's interested in farming. We've also looked at leasing. We have a lot of absenteeism when it comes to forest land in this area. So we wanted to explore who might be interested in leasing land to the landless or land seekers who would like to forest farm, and found some pretty promising results in the region in that regard. We've also, those involved in the coalition, this is actually out of Penn State, but Eric Burkhardt has long been involved, has conducted some economic research around how do existing price points for wild harvest material match up against what would be necessary to make it profitable for a forest farmer. And we found essentially it's only ginseng because it has that high price point, because the historic price points associated with wild harvest material have been very low. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to farm when those price points are low. And that's been one of the key functions of the coalition outside of some of our training and engagement, has been to work with the industry to connect with forest farmers and realize higher price points associated with those products because of predictability, because of traceability, and the impact that it has here in those local regions. And those price points have come up now with respect to certain companies where we're seeing profit margins as a possibility now for forest farmers. If they just took the old prices, it wouldn't work. And speaking of old prices, here we are. You look at black cohosh, estimated dry volume on an annual basis coming out of our region that we studied, 264,000 dried pounds or so, which is thousands and thousands and thousands of plants, by the way, with a mean dry price point of $3.62. That is stuck in time 30, 40, 50 years ago. The forest farming model is about trying to move that up because there's greater predictability and sustainability associated with it. Now, not just looking at what's the state of the market, where's the trade happening, who will do it, but also building infrastructure. And one of the coalition partners, Appalachian Sustainable Development, has been a leader in that regard in creating an Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub, where small volumes of material that come off of forest farms can be aggregated to meet large purchase orders. But it's not just about the aggregation, it's also about processing to make sure that material is to spec to meet that purchase order. So this is a collective, and we're looking to expand these nodes of these processing facilities where that material can meet the large volumetric demand on part of companies. And I talked about price point earlier. Through the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub and the connections they've made with the market, you can see black cohosh root no longer $7.96 per kilo. Now let's take the $3 and plus cents per dry pound. Now the price points are upwards of 45 for that material. That makes a difference when it comes to a forest farmer wanting to take the risk of setting out a shade obligate perennial and grow it to maturity for market, because that's a 6-7 year process. So those price points, when you look at Eric Burkhart's work out of Penn State, would make a profit margin happen for those producers. And I mentioned earlier, thinking about landed forest farmers, but also working with the wild harvesting community that wants to be part of a forest farming transition in the region. We created a point of harvest program to work with those that are long involved in the wild harvesting trade and the primary buyers that also want to provide training and partnerships for their enterprise in the region. And the point of harvest programming is just that. We are working with those primary buyers and those wild harvesters who want to show up to the table to get training in plant ID, propagation, stewardship, sustainable harvest, and post-harvest handling, so that they can be part of a movement in the region. Despite the fact that they don't own land, we're training them to legally access land and formalize the trade when it comes to some of those long-standing markets that have happened, but now under the broader umbrella of forest farming. And they receive a card. There's chain of custody work that happens as part of this, and they keep records and all of that type of thing. And those are assessed for compliance in terms of the program. I'd also like to celebrate the fact that we've received funding, yes, from USDA and the federal side, but you know, some of the family offices are stepping up in terms of the agroforestry work that we and others are involved in, and the Edwards Mother Earth Foundation has been a leader in that, and we're very grateful for the support, because we've been able to create a grant program that is working with farmers that have open lands that want to establish agroforestry, but also those that are working in the understory. And we've, through our first round of applications through this Catalyzing Agroforestry Grants program, we received over 100 applications and were able to fund 28 forest farming projects. We were fortunate enough to receive a second commitment from the family office, and we are on the cusp of reviewing our second round of applications, and we've received over 120 applications. And initially we focused in Appalachia, but now we're extending beyond throughout all states except for Alaska, and we have applications that have moved westward. We've also received funding recently from the Appalachian Regional Commission to address some of the infrastructure pain points that we've been able to identify through our work in the coalition. We received a planning grant, $500,000 to have the coalition work on building a proposal to go in for a potential implementation grant, which could be on the order of $6, $8, maybe $10 million, to address things like marketing, processing, aggregation, distribution, to expand those points of processing that I highlighted earlier that are occurring through Appalachian Sustainable Development. Also work on business planning so that we can formalize forest farming businesses, workforce development, the tourism and cultural aspects as well, and the planting stock equation, because that is a bit of a bottleneck. We don't have great access to root starter stock with some of these specialty understory species or seeds and those types of things. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in that regard, but ARC is looking to for us to come up with an implementation proposal to provide that kind of green market-based solution to expand upon some of the growth that we've seen through the coalition. And most recently, which is great news, Rural Action, which is part of our coalition, is in the midst of organizing a cooperative agreement that's been awarded from the Forest Service, upwards of $6 million, to address some of the explicit issues that were identified in the ARC proposal. And ARC requires match, and they allow federal match. So we're now looking at the Forest Service making a pretty significant investment that is going to potentially be coupled with the Appalachian Regional Commission support if in fact we're successful with an implementation proposal. So we have built the base. We've identified pathways that need to be addressed. We've explored ways to do that in smaller scales. Now we want to amplify that and expand. And so we're at the cusp of some pretty interesting, substantial investments to move forward in that regard. Outside of the Appalachian Coalition, Yale University submitted a proposal that modeled the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition, and that was funded by USDA. So there is a sibling coalition in the Northeast. The Midwest, through Lincoln University and University of Missouri, has put in a proposal to NRCS, and we feel very confident about that proposal to establish a coalition in the Midwest. And I just offer, since we're talking on different shores here, Pacific Northwest. You have a working group, thinking about maybe a specific coalition or other form that could be also a sibling to what's happening in these different regions. I mentioned the Gather to Grow conference. Thinking about our sponsors there, just want to thank them. We had industry, family offices. We had some of our nonprofits step up. We had our agencies step up to help support that. It was a huge success. You can see our keynotes, Janine Davis and Olivia Watkins. We had panels with industry. We had breakout sessions. We had a pre-conference field day at the Catawba Sustainability Center. And you can see some pretty interesting sketch art that came out of that field day as well. But one of the big announcements at the conference was that the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition, that name was structured based upon the Beginning Farmer Rancher Development Program through NIFA. But we announced that we're no longer beginning. Our history is pretty rich here, going back to 2011, 2014 or so. We are now the Appalachian Forest Farmer Coalition. So we're transitioning our name into that, cementing it. And on top of that, we have also been involved in, and Virginia Tech's leading this, developing an American Forest Farming Association, which would be a larger umbrella over, and not to supplant the different regional and local work that's happening, but to help support, be a voice at the national scale for the work that's happening on a regional and local sense. And we had partners from across the country that worked over the course of a year to develop a draft charter for the American Forest Farming Association. We're going to use the logo out of the conference for AFFA. And we're now in a period presently of public review for that charter. So I would encourage Patrick to send out that link. We have had some input from the Pacific Northwest. That would be great. And I'd also like to thank Eric Jones, who came out of Oregon State. And we had a meeting in Arlington in January to really kind of cement and finalize that draft charter so that we can submit it for public review. And then we'll go back and revise that charter based upon that input. And then we want to move forward to build funds for that AFFA so that it can ultimately become kind of a self-sufficient organization and help support, and like I said, be a voice, not supplant, but to support the local regional work. I don't know where I am on time. Yeah, I should probably knock off now, but this is just a busy chart to show you that there was a lot of work that came out of the coalition and the partnerships and other work that's materialized beyond our region that's led to this AFFA and kind of working to establish that, again, evolving some of the representation and building infrastructure, human infrastructure and organizational infrastructure to help expand and continue. So maybe right on time at 40 there. I'll leave it at that, stop sharing my screen if I can see how to do that. Let's see. Okay, on leave meeting, stop share. So thanks for your patience and time as I kind of walk through a lot of history and maybe some blood, sweat, and tears on the part of some great organizations in the region.
Thanks, John. That was fantastic. I really appreciate that. I'd never really gotten the full history on the coalition. I didn't realize you guys went that far back to 2014. So um so we have a lot of time for questions. I generated a lot of questions in my head during that time, but I don't want to hog it. Does anybody want to start with a question? Otherwise, I'm happy to get the ball rolling. Give it a few seconds. You can type them in the chat too, and I'm happy to read them out. Well, I'll get started then. What I was hoping you could speak a little more to what was behind that raise in prices versus wild versus cultivated. And I think one of the reasons I'm asking is because, I know you're fairly familiar with the region and the state of forest farming, so to speak. And a lot of it is that it's still mostly non-timber forest product harvesting, wild harvesting, not a whole lot of intensive cultivation. And I think one of the reasons is that a lot of these crops aren't necessarily high value yet. They don't really have that profitability that you're talking about. So it's just you spoke to it a little bit, but I wonder if you could elaborate a little more on what was behind that.
I think we can start with the economics of it all. The proposition of planting, like first procuring stock and seed or whatever it may be, and the labor and the time that goes into establishing a farm, that's an expense. And then there's the risk over time of bringing that to market. And because the conventional wild harvesting model is that, listen, there are great stewards out there that are foraging and working underneath the canopy. Unfortunately, the recognition has not been there, but both in terms of kind of what it takes for that to happen, but also the kind of disparaging cartoon-like nature in the ways which many of the wild harvesters are characterized. And the bottom line really is that those the materials that are being harvested, there's not been the risk involved in bringing that material to market. It's risky to go in the woods. It's risky to get out and harvest, and it's risky to try and sell. But at the end of the day, the intentional model requires that risk to be absorbed and the time that it takes to bring that to market. And that doesn't match up against the price points relative to that labor and that risk when it comes to forest farming. And so to be out there promoting and working with individuals who want to get involved with that cultivation, we also necessarily had to work on the side of the market to draw attention to the benefits associated with forest farming and create a consciousness on the part of the industry who they are looking closely at that aspect. Of course, I mean, they depend upon those raw materials, and to be competitive in the marketplace with increasing attention around the impacts to the resource associated with the product that's on the shelf. We worked in that space to find those companies that were cutting edge and saw value in that and were willing to put the right prices on the table so that forest farmers, not just in terms of kind of good intentions or interest, could actually see something at the end of their production cycles that would pay off. And I just want to say too that we've worked in that wild harvesting space, and we're working with those that want to show up, because a segment of the wild harvesters that have that cultural tradition and are good stewards lament the fact that they have been characterized in ways that are disparaging, or they haven't had any partners in their trade. And so and the bad actors in the industry are typically not going to show up to training programs or partner in that type of more formal activity. So we're working to try and cut across both landholders and landless and bring value to all of their activities that make their enterprise profitable.
Yeah, I thought your point of harvest program was really neat. That's pretty interesting. It's something that could be valuable here. If I could ask just a quick follow-up question. I mean, you mentioned drawing attention to the benefits of forest farming. Like, what were the benefits that really you felt kind of locked in? Was it like the environmental benefits, or like the consistency and the quality of the product? Is that more on that side? Just curious what really kind of shined there.
I think one thing that's interesting about a coalition is that, there are different interests.
Yeah.
There's a broad general interest in kind of, a benefit and seeing kind of like a future. But, we have different areas of expertise and areas of energy, and conservation through cultivation is kind of a term that drove many of our coalition partners toward this in terms of their interest in sustaining healthy, vibrant plant populations, mushroom populations, and ensuring that what's happening in the understory and what's happening in our forests as market grows is not depleting, denuding those, but rather expanding and enhancing. So there was that angle, but then there was also, the idea or the interest on the market side. And, like if I think about Appalachian Sustainable Development or maybe some other organizations that are like Oak, they're interested in how do we improve value proposition for rural communities, and that's an important aspect. So for them, it's about let's pursue economic development, and this is an opportunity. If we can match kind of the conservation interest with the economic side, then we're starting to get into a space where we're leveraging and using and interacting with our resources here in a way that achieves the conservation goal, but at the same time, by doing that, is also adding value to rural communities. So, we have different interests, and then of course, the idea of promoting change more broadly and thinking about forests holistically, which was an interest of mine as a forest management extension specialist. A lot of my research as a graduate student and early in my career at Virginia Tech has been on what's happening in our woodlands. What is the state of health in our woodlands?
Mm.
And how do we better connect people with that resource in a way that prompts active management? And so when we take people that come to our events out that have access to these resources, that are stewards, and walk in, one of the first things you say is that we can't just look down, we have to look up, because we have to think about that living green infrastructure, which creates the appropriate habitat conditions to cultivate the understory. But you also have to think about that, because it's not something that like a hoop house or something constructed by humans. This is dynamic, is a dynamic ecosystem, and you have to think about managing that component in addition to the understory. And that's where that agroforestry model comes in, as a kind of a multi-layered management approach. So, that was an interest of mine. So those kind of intersected in a way that just fit within this larger interest in, how do we evolve and improve our understory management in the region, knowing these longstanding markets exist and communities have long worked in those spaces and have a need for economic development and community improvement.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm also very interested in that intersection of using forest farming to encourage forest stewardship. I think that's a really neat model. Kath asked a question in the chat. She asked if you are working with or in contact with any organizations in Canada as part of the coalition work.
We have not done that. I think by virtue primarily of the federal funding that we have and our kind of concentrated physiographic focus. However, we do have a series of videos where we went up to Canada around fiddlehead ferns, and we were focusing in on that particular product and worked with individuals in Canada. Now, I have come across through the North American Agroforestry Conference and some work in AFTA when I was involved with AFTA, which is North American Canadian stakeholders. And one of our first meetings that set in motion our strategic planning around the coalition coming out of that community of practice was held at Cornell University's Arnott Forest. And we had 3 or 4 Canadians that participated in that meeting. So we have had some cross-border collaboration, but nothing formally. And with the American Forest Farming Association, that came out of USDA funding, so we have that in place. I would say there are definitely opportunities. I think about like Society of American Foresters and their interaction with the Canadian equivalent. Every 5 or 10 years they get together, and there's lots of collaboration there. So I think on the research angle and communication, that there's great opportunity as we move forward.
Mark, do you have a question?
John, thank you. It's good to hear your words again. I wish I would have written down some of those cool key lines that you said. One of the things that I keep getting asked in this region, and this is a question I've posed to you before, so I'm hoping you can just reiterate it. Given the different agencies, the landowners, the farmers, the people that just want to go out and tend, DNR, conservation districts, NRCS. If you were to go back to the starting point and hit reset and start again, what's the process to begin and moving forward with all these agencies?
So it's a good question. We were limited by how to find space in the funding arena. And so we had to be strategic in that regard. And again, just kind of starting up with a network like this, we maybe were a little bit narrow in our focus. I also think too that, and maybe this is what we discussed or what one idea I shared or notion about what we could have done a little bit differently. But I think at that time too, we were also in a space where there wasn't the momentum we see now. There wasn't the tipping point we see now. So our allies outside of, say, just working to engage beginning new producers through a funding structure that would get us up and running, there were some that were at the table, and the National Agroforestry Center is a great example
Nice
of
of
that.
you.
Say again?
I think that was
Oh,
just
okay.
an unmute.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But what I've seen is that's grown over time. Could we have pushed harder in that regard and rolled out kind of a technical service provider training component? Could we have tried to engage other funding sources? I think we could have. I don't know what our success would have been and how that would have drained our resources relative to the opportunities that were on the table. I think that we're all fortunate to be in the place we are right now. And there were some, I won't say gambles that were made, but we went and just pushed, knowing the kind of energies and resources we had in the region, and things being kind of defined and understood on the part of a small base to say, let's work in a concentrated sense, start here, and then we'll leverage that or celebrate that in ways as we build that momentum to draw attention to it. And could we have imagined that we would be in a place where we are right now, where standards are being stood up on a state level around forest farming, that some of our work has been a part of that, and is part of that? We couldn't have, but maybe if we had the crystal ball back then, we might have said, hey, maybe we can start to develop a TSP program or engage with different stakeholders and those types of things. Those things materialized along the way, which I think we were fortunate for.
Nice. So, Michael had a question in the chat, and he jumped on a little late, so he apologizes if you talked about this already. But he said, could you share more how you've developed markets and a customer base for these products? Is the challenge to forest farming more about supply or demand?
It's both. I can say that. I mean, we are very pleased to see that we've had, I think we've estimated, based upon some survey work we've done in the coalition, that 150 farms have been established. And I noted like EMEF's funding has led to establishment of 22 more. That base of production, when you think about just one species alone in high demand, like black cohosh or golden seal, there's a lot more room for establishment and growing toward meeting that market demand. So that is still very much a work in progress, but that continues to grow. In terms of the demand side, the coalition doesn't take direct credit for this, but we were involved, and it was really kind of some visionary industry actors that were picking up on some of this, kind of going back to Mark's question, like, listen, we were just shooting off fireworks and like trying to get things moving. Industry started to recognize that, because I think they're dealing with their own issues around supply chain. I don't claim to know all the ins and outs of that, but I definitely know they're interested in what 10 years looks like, what the quality of product looks like, what their messaging looks like, and what kind of foundation is behind that. And Mountain Rose Herbs, as an example, was one of the first ones to step out in conjunction with one of the coalition partners, United Plant Savers, and a program that was developed out of Penn State, the Forest Grown Verification Program, and invest in that and create labeling around that. And that was risky for a company to do, but it was a strong signal. It was one company taking that step. And then that step led, in a course of 3 years, on the back of some work ASD did to help kind of build out infrastructure to get small volumes across forest farms up to a scale that meets a purchase order that a company needs to service consumers the world over. That led to other companies seeing that somebody did it. Now maybe we can do it, because we're also thinking about the same things. It went from one company to 5 companies in a matter of 3 years. Now we're looking at growing demand. Does it need to grow further? Yes, it does. But we're in those conversations with those companies. But we also think locally too. I mean, we have apothecaries and other types of regional local businesses, brick and mortar processing, other types that are looking at investing and have invested at the price points that matter, and then working on their business model to kind of carry that through so they can pay those prices, and consumers can purchase with confidence around those materials. So it's a matter of both, and both still need work, basically. But where we were in 2011 with respect to where we are today, I think that there's been some substantial change in that regard. And you can look at who's sponsoring our conference, and we have several large industries that you're probably all, or companies that you're all familiar with, that have invested in this and are at the table having conversations about what the future looks like.
Awesome. Well, it is 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock your time, so that's probably dinner time. I want to honor that. Really appreciate you coming and speaking to us. I do have one really quick question. I remember on the slide you said, with all of the different botanicals that come out of the forest, I noticed poison ivy leaves, and I have to ask what that's about, because I'm probably allergic to poison ivy.
I'm glad you picked up on that, because often I do point out poison ivy just to kind of show the scope of but indeed there is some demand around poison ivy, and I don't claim to know exactly how it's used, but herbalists are able to integrate that and utilize it, I believe. It's small scale in demand. Like you think about Virginia snake root, that's a really difficult one to work with because it's highly toxic. That's small demand, but there's trade around it.
Yeah.
What we've done is focus primarily on some of the larger volume species in the area, and that makes sense for connecting there. But it basically shows that we have a lot of goods from the woods that come out, and I'm sure you do in the Pacific Northwest as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Thanks. I wondered maybe it
maybe
was
poison ivy is Forest Farms down the road someday. I don't want to be the one farming it, but
no. God, no. Mike did ask quickly if there is a website for the American Forest Farming Council. Probably
Yeah.
not yet, is there?
No, well, we have a tab on our Appalachian Forest Farmer Coalition website now. We've changed the name. So if you go to AppalachianForestFarmers.org, we have that website or that tab on the website. It's under initiatives. You can click that, and we have a QR code and a hyperlink to the public comment survey, which is online. You can take that. You can kind of read through what's on the table presently for review, provide comments along those lines. And I would offer too that, would love to stay in touch with the working group and other activities that are underway there in terms of how the association as evolves can be a good solid partner to support in ways that the regional local work can't. Again, it's not about supplanting, it's about supporting. So
yeah.
looking on the horizon. So
Yeah.
appreciate the time. Yeah.
And I'll be sure to send out that the commentary link to the whole work group, even folks that aren't here.
Great. Yeah, that would be fantastic. All of the links, you've got them, so
Yeah.
you can send them around. Yeah, perfect.
Well, I could say there's strong interest in developing a coalition here, at least on my part, and we have a few forest farming projects funded recently that are really exciting. So we'd like to stay in touch, and yeah, just thanks again, John. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the invitation, and good to spend time with you folks.
All right, thanks. Have a good night.
Yep, bye.
All right. Yeah, it is. Well, I guess it's 3 o'clock, so a lot of people are hopping off. I don't know if we want to stick around for the last half hour. We have such a small group today, but we usually spend the last half hour to do introductions and um, talk about updates. I have a little PowerPoint slide with a few like grants that are open and things like that, but we don't necessarily have to get into that. If people decide we want to hop off early, that's fine. But I do see a few new faces. It would be nice to, yeah, Michael.
Yeah.
I would love to hear a policy advisor at DNR.
I know.
Pretty excited.
First time caller, long time listener. I don't know. So I was part of the Forest Stewardship Plan, the coach training last winter.
Nice.
As a small forest landowner, my husband and I have 5 acres on Harsteen Island in Mason County. But since then, I've joined DNR. I work within the executive team and the policy office. I've got everything from urban and community forestry to the bioeconomy. So I both have like a personal interest and a professional interest in this work group. I do have some meetings that kind of overlap with this one, but was able to jump off and participate. So yeah, I'm not quite sure where I want to plug in like officially just yet, but was happy to jump on this call.
Well, we're glad to have you. Yeah. We have some people with the DNR that join now and then. We were saying earlier, whenever it gets warm, the attendance really kind of takes a dip.
Yeah.
But yeah, really excited to have you. Actually, do you know by chance Matt Preventure?
No, I don't.
He lives on Harsteen Island as well. He works for the DNR. He's the Service Forest Program Manager. So you guys are probably neighbors, knowing the size of Harsteen Island. So.
I'm sure we're one person removed, both in the office and also on Harsteen.
Nice. Okay, cool. Is there anyone else that wants to do? Marisha, I think you went. I don't remember if you were around for the last meeting or not. I know we know each other, but it would be great to have you introduce yourself.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Marisha Auerbach. I live in Olympia, Washington. I have a farm that's just under 5 acres that I just got in January. So I'm looking to do a lot of agroforestry implementation. My primary job is working for Oregon State University. I was in Portland for many years, and I've been working for OSU remotely for the last 13 years. With the permaculture program, we have a number of different permaculture classes. My specialty is food forestry. I have a small plant nursery at my farm, specializing in permaculture-based plants. So far, my nursery previously was on my urban lot in Portland, where I was growing about 85% of my own food. So my woody species are have been limited in the past because I didn't really have that much space. But now I have lots of space, and so the woody species will be increasing since I like to have those in 2-gallon pots. So yeah, I'm glad to be here. It's often difficult for me to join in the middle of the day since I have so much computer time. And by the end of my OSU computer time for working remotely, I need to not do any more computer time and get out in the nursery. But I had just met John at the North American Agroforestry Conference. And so I thought I'd pop in on this one. It seemed like a good time to meet you all and to catch his talk.
That's right. You went to Costa Rica for, yeah. How was that, by the way?
It was great. Yeah. I've been wanting to go to Cartier for a really long time. I also work with, I do international permaculture work. So I work with a place called the Maya Mountain Research Farm in southern Belize, Toledo district. And that is a agroforestry farm that specializes in cacao and vanilla and coffee. And it's in the Quechua Maya community. So it was neat to go to. I had heard from my friend that I work with there, Christopher Nesbitt, a lot about Cartier, and I've worked a lot with indigenous coffee farmers and cacao farmers. So that was a interesting aspect of the North American Agroforestry Conference, but also just seeing how well networked everyone is on the East Coast. You know, getting to know all the folks from University of Missouri and Virginia Tech Agroforestry Institute, and I see there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration and inspiration between all of our groups.
Yeah, I agree. And I kind of want to put it to you and the broader group of thoughts about forming a Pacific Northwest Forest Farming Coalition. Like, what you mean? You're very in tune, Marisha, to like the community, like the permaculture community for sure, and the broader agroforestry community. My concern about forest farming in this region, it feels very underdeveloped to me. It feels very the cultivation piece, it just feels like it's much more emphasized on the wild harvest piece. And so I wonder if we can sustain a coalition, but at the same time, a coalition can do a lot to generate adoption and interest. So yeah, what was your thoughts on that?
Well, I'd like to hear more like what's the difference between a coalition and a working group? I don't know like the different definitions. But for me, I know my bandwidth is probably just one online group. But I would be really interested in more activities and things where we can get together and do things live and in person.
Right.
And since we are bioregional, we might want to be really strategic about when those things are, particularly seasonal. But that could be something like of a coalition having site tours or so I guess that's the gradient of like what's internal and what's external. Like what do we have as our core group, and then what do we put out to the public?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I mean, this work group is broad agroforestry, right? It's meant, I mean, we're going to talk. We have speakers and meetings about way more than just forest farming. I think the coalition, the way I heard John say it, is it was built out of a community of practice. So it's built out of people that were essentially doing this already, but wanted to pool resources, learn from each other, pool crops to meet those minimum, yields to attract company buys and things like that. So yeah, sort of a co-op almost. kind of bordering that line between a coalition and a co-op. And that's where, I know Oregon has a woodland owners co-op that's done some work with non-timber forest products that I always wondered if it couldn't be like adopted to both states. But I think that's the key difference between, like, this work group is more of a learning group, networking opportunity, whereas I think a coalition would be more of a community of practice that would kind of, corral existing growers to work together.
Well, just one example that I've heard about recently is, our local herb shop down in Olympia, Radiance, would love to be buying more things from local growers, but they don't have most local growers don't have quite the quantity, the dependability, to be able to supply Radiance with what they need. So since so many medicinal herbs are non-timber forest products, whether they're native or non-native, they can be grown in the natives can be grown in a native forest setting, but the non-natives do really well in a food forest setting. And so that seems like a just clear opportunity for a coalition here just in Olympia. And that's not even talking about the places in our broader bioregion.
Do you know what they're looking for specific, like any specific examples of like the kind of crops that they're most interested in?
I would imagine I don't remember what the person mentioned. Some that come up for me are oat straw, nettles. What else from the forest?
Like Oregon grape, was that one of them?
Oregon grape. And I know also Forrest Schomer up in Port Townsend inside Passage Seeds. He's a native seedsman, and I sold him native seeds for a long time that I was harvesting from Wild Time. And so from the forest, I work with Wild Time Farm. I didn't mention that. That's in Oakville, 150 acre permaculture, agroforestry, and forest farm. And so there's another marketing opportunity where he's looking for seeds from native wildflowers, and he buys Oregon grape seed. So, with Oregon grape, we can look at all sorts of different yields because there's the root that the radiants might want, but then there's also the berries and the seeds.
Yeah. No,
and
that's
berries,
helpful.
I think Forrest takes he separates the berries and the seeds, and then the berries, I think, go to Fin River cider.
Oh, really? Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so once we take all our native berries, then we have a whole nother, supply chain thing that we could do with having, ciders or wines or syrups, dried fruit.
Well, yeah, that seems like a really good opportunity for like a microcosm of a coalition to kind of try that model out and see if we can corral like growers in the Olympia area to grow enough product to entice Radiance or Fin River or whomever.
Yeah.
Maybe we should work on that together.
Okay. And Fin River has both Forrest Schomer with Inside Passage Seeds at their he has a plot at their property up in Chimacum, but they also have Michael Pilarski up there. Okay. So yeah, but those are both people that should be a part of the coalition.
That's interesting. Okay.
Well, I do have an herb grower from our area coming over at 4. He might have a better sense of what Radiance is looking for.
Just making a note. I might circle back with you on this.
Please do. You'll be safe.
Yeah, with the site. So I totally deviated from some introductions, and then we had Robert hop on as well. Robert, would you want to take a minute and introduce yourself? You missed John, but there will be a recording.
Sorry, I'm very, very late, everybody. I was in the middle of running a field trip. So I'm Robert Swan. I'm a PhD candidate and an instructor at the University of Washington in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. My dissertation work involves classic industrial forestry, so it doesn't have much of an agroforestry element to it. But I personally am very passionate about agroforestry, permaculture in general. That is sort of how I got introduced to being interested in the natural world, and all that was gardening. And my first job as a high schooler was working on a small permaculture farm in my hometown. So I love all this stuff. We've also just recently reformed our chapter of the Society of American Foresters, and I've been setting up some fun research projects to give students experience doing research projects, interesting things that they find worthwhile. And they have so far taken primarily an agroforestry spin. So Patrick and I met, he and I were chatting about a shiitake mushroom log using waste logs project I have set up. We also just planted an agroforestry, a few acres of that at University of Washington's Pack Forest. We're going to be measuring some orchards as sort of a food forest sort of thing in the local vicinity. We're maybe going to do a honeybee or other bee experiment sort of thing with regards to forage availability. So I love agroforestry. I find it really fun and interesting and worthwhile. And any opportunity I get to work with that sort of thing, I like to jump in on it. So thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for joining. I'm curious, I know you mentioned the pack forest planting. Can you tell us a little more about that? Well, how did that shake out?
Yeah, so a little bit of backstory. If anybody may know the name Don Balzer, he was a Forest Service guy. He's kind of one of the old guard. He passed away about 10 years ago now, but he purchased 20 acres of land in the Skagit Valley outside of Mount Vernon back in the 80s and planted it up with primarily sweet chestnuts, black walnuts, and English walnuts as kind of a cultivar collection. So it's this really, really diverse genetically diverse population of those three species and some other fun stuff as well. And I met the owners about 5 years ago, and they were very gracious to let me gather a whole bunch of seed to grow seedlings out. So for the last 5 years, I've been growing a whole bunch of seedlings. And if anybody's ever spent time growing trees, you know it tends to multiply. It's kind of like, if you're also familiar with the term chicken math, right? You never have 3 chickens, it turns into 5, which turns into 10, which turns into 50. So I ended up with a few thousand tree seedlings of which I don't personally have a spot to plant them yet. So I got permission from UW's Pack Forest to take about 3 acres, and we planted about 600 trees down there, mostly chestnuts, but also black walnuts, English walnuts, butternuts, persimmons, pawpaws, lots of fun stuff, basically pine nuts, and sort of relieved a little bit of pressure off of my own collection by doing that. And it'll be something interesting. And so I'm kind of thinking it as a complement to this other project. So I think we need to plant more trees now so that we can have 10, 20, 30-year-old orchards to do experiments on later. And not enough people are doing that, I would be so bold as to say. And so part of that as well is we can compare and contrast that planting with the already existing planting in the Skagit Valley, which is 30 or 40 years old now. So we're taking tree cores, heights, and that sort of thing, and sort of trying to do an assessment of the total value generation, both in terms of timber and in terms of how much food will have roughly been produced per acre. And I'm interested in it as particularly for small landowners as an alternative to traditional forest management, particularly because it spreads out the income stream. I think the having to wait at least 20 years before a commercial thinning or 40 years before a real income is a big threat to persistent small ownership. Especially around here, especially in the face of all this development that I know we're all aware of. So, but yeah, it shook out good. It's a gently north-facing slope, so not what I would have necessarily thought was ideal, but turned out the soil was really good. It's a really accessible spot. There's hiking trails going right by it with lots of people, so it'll be really an interesting thing for the public. While we were planting, I had 5 different groups of people come up and go, "What are you doing?" And we said, we're planting chestnuts and pine nuts, and they all went, "Oh my gosh, that's so cool." So the public sentiment is good so far.
Nice. That's
Right.
great.
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
I'll be there in a few weeks, so I might ask Greg
Yeah,
if
so
he can show me.
if Greg's there, or Chase Byers, the day-to-day manager, he'll know where it is as well.
Okay.
It just looks like a whole mess of tree tubes right now. Along
Robert,
those lines as well, go ahead.
Oh, I just have a colleague working on some avoided conversion projects, preventing, working forests from being converted into development projects. And it never even occurred to me to look at food forests as a strategy for that income in between harvests. So yeah, I might reach out.
The other one is the mushrooms, and Patrick is probably more of the expert on that, because not only is it a spread out and diversified income stream, but it also encourages active management. So, you get that lumber by thinning and by being firewise and all that stuff, or that timber rather. So I think there's a ton of potential in all of these different systems, biochar, for instance, all this kind of stuff that you're creating a product and it's spread out and it encourages active management.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of overlap with conservation objectives.
Right. So, I think there's the interesting discussion. You were talking about native plants like Oregon grape, for instance. The trade-off, so we don't have a lot of native agroforestry species, at least not necessarily high quality ones in terms of trees. So the trade-off between native or non-native species as far as that is interesting. But I think even something like a sweet chestnut, if it's European or whatever it is, still provides a ton of wildlife value and conservation value in those terms.
Yeah.
Just for example.
Yeah, yeah, and there's plenty you can cultivate beneath the native canopy too.
Right.
Non-natives, you know.
Yeah.
Mike, I saw your comment in the chat. I would love to. I know you've joined our group meetings before, if you're there, but it would be great to have you introduce yourself and talk about your interests in the Forest Farming Coalition. Got a few minutes left here.
I'll be really brief. Hello, everyone. I'm Mike DeVerde. I'm actually a Boeing engineer. I'm doing this on the side. Let's see how to briefly describe this. I formed a group a couple of years ago called the Omni Futurists. We're concerned about loss of jobs from artificial intelligence and robotics. And one of the ways to deal with the perhaps tidal wave of unemployment is setting up farming, local farming, smallholder farming for people to just kind of survive. And one of the things that you look at the Pacific Northwest is some of the things like chestnuts and mushrooms that perhaps people could make some sort of a living off of. So I'm just a student. I'm not very far along in my efforts. I tune in every once in a while because agroforestry and forest farming is clearly, perennials are clearly the way to go. I was very interested in some of the work in the Midwest on some of the American chestnuts, hazels, American hazels, and I'm interested in actually the beaked hazels. So beaked hazels and some mushrooms in the back. I've got 5 acres. It's residential, right? But I'm doing some pilot projects to try to learn a little bit more, follow what you professionals are doing. So that's my story, real quick.
That's awesome. Thanks, Mike. I love the diversity of our group, and this is a great it's a great place to stay connected. So I hope you'll continue to attend meetings.
I will.
Thanks. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left. There's a couple people that well, Deborah, I know you introduced yourself earlier. If you're still on, you're with Edward's Mother Earth, and I think it would be cool because John mentioned them. If you could tell us a little more about what they do. If you're still on, I'll give you a few seconds. I told you I have to wait 7 seconds. All right, Deborah, may let Noah. Are you available to give a quick intro? I know you've been to our meetings as well.
Yeah, let's see. Get my camera on here. All right, yeah. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I've been in attendance of these kind of regularly. But yeah, good. I really like the, you know, when you bring in people from outside the group to talk about what's going on, and then I enjoy the internal discussions. I work with Natural Resource Conservation Service. I'm the area resource conservationist based out of the Olympia area office, but I work in the west side of Washington. I provide support to our field staff on conservation planning and technical assistance. And so I always have my ear to the ground on kind of what other, you know, groups are working on, and, you know, avenues where, you know, NRCS will cross paths with that. And potentially, as I don't know if everyone knows about NRCS, but we do provide conservation planning, technical assistance, and financial assistance to implement conservation practices that are identified through the conservation planning process. So we provide quite a bit of financial assistance to what we call non-industrial private forest landowners, or what you might refer to as small farm small forest landowners. And we have two main programs: environmental quality incentives program and conservation stewardship program, that we deliver that financial assistance through. And we have signups happening annually. There's application deadlines, and we have a ranking, assessment and ranking process. There's competition. Applications compete for funding, but we do have a lot of practices that support, basically, we are here to support clients' objectives, and we have conservation practices that can pretty much back those up. First and foremost, we try to address existing resource concerns through EQIP, and then conservation stewardship program is for kind of those who have resolved resource concerns on their property and kind of want to look at some various, we call them enhancements. It's kind of the practices amped up a little bit with different criteria, but we have a lot of just practices and enhancements that can support agroforestry, forest farming, growing perennial crops in various land uses. So
Yeah, I just learned that CSP can actually pay for big leaf maple syrup product, not necessarily directly for the equipment, but big leaf maple sugaring is a CSP enhancement practice. Have you heard about that?
I have not heard about that.
I ran into Aaron Kreutz at a conference, and we should talk because I'm really interested in seeing how that could apply, because that would be a big deal for people that are trying to get into that.
Yeah, it could be something in the works, maybe, that hasn't been released yet. But yeah, I know Erin is our state NRCS state forester, and so she would probably be on top of the new things that are coming out. But yeah, we have a lot of enhancements for just like planting food crops. We have practices for that, enhancements for planting cultural species. And so a lot of, if you wanted to fill in kind of the understory with medicinal cultural plants, there's definitely enhancements for that. And CSP, we're really trying to promote that because I would say it's underutilized here in Western Washington for sure for forest landowners. And we do have quite a bit of funds available for that. And they just did actually increase the minimum. CSP is an interesting program because it's a 5-year contract. It provides annual payments for your existing management system. And it used to be it's based on the resource concerns met at the time of application. And, if someone who had a good forest stand usually would come out to about maybe $2,000 annual payment. Well, they bumped up the annual payment to $4,000. So it's looking really good, especially for those with small acres, to have a CSP contract. And for CSP, there's no size restriction as far as your field or stand. So it's definitely something for clients to look at. And if you're, in the capacity where you're assisting landowners and producers and you don't know about NRCS CSP program, feel free to, contact me. I'd be happy to give you a rundown. There's a lot of good information on our websites as well.
Yeah, CSP.
And any landowner or clients, the best approach is to contact your local NRCS field office and their staff, who can assist you and go on a site visit. You can talk about what you want to do, and that's a good place to start.
Yeah, thanks, Noah. I agree. CSP is really underutilized. I help manage a property in Lewis County, and we make some snags every year, and we get payments for it, and it's really great. So I encourage people to explore that. It's 3:30 though, and time to call it. I really appreciate you guys attending. And I don't think we have anything planned for our next meeting yet in June, but we'll figure that out shortly. And then we take August off, of course. But yeah, so thank you all. I'll send out the recording probably tomorrow or the next day if anybody wants to catch what they missed. Well, that's all I've got, I think.
Thanks, everyone.
Nice to meet all you guys. Looking forward to seeing more of you.
Yeah. Thanks, Robert.
Bye, guys.